Hello, everybody. How can you connect APIs to ChatGPT? How can you just talk to your APIs? That's something that we will dive into today. We'll look into how to connect an API to ChatGPT so that you can just talk to it and ask questions in natural language, which I think is really, really cool and may be the new way how we talk to APIs going forward. With me is Alexandre Airvault of Blobr.io. Hey, Alex, how are you doing?
Hi Eric, very good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for taking the time to prepare a little demo and walk us through how you've been doing that. So you have added features to your API portal, the Blobber, so that it becomes a little bit easier to work with the APIs and ChatGPT. And I think that's really interesting, and I think it's also a great way for us to talk about what it actually takes to
Mhm.
design and define, so to speak, APIs for ChatGPT. So let's dive right in and look into some of the specifics where you found out that even though you can use APIs in ChatGPT, there are a couple of limitations for these ChatGPT plugins that are maybe a little bit challenging or require some attention. So let's talk about how to create API specifications for ChatGPT. Can you share with us just a little bit what you learned, what really critical issues are?
Yeah, definitely. What we have seen with ChatGPT is that you can plug any of your APIs, REST APIs to ChatGPT, but there are some requirements or key important things to look at. First, it's really to have operation IDs at the level of your pass to really help ChatGPT understand how your API is structured. So that's one of the key things that you need to look at. Another thing that is actually a limitation from ChatGPT is that the size of the response should not be too long from your API. There is a limit around 4,000 characters. So it means that potentially if you have a long API, you need to filter out some elements and limit the output of the API. And then there are other things which are quite generic, I would say requirements or recommendations for API spec with clear descriptions for all your parameters. You have as well a unique description for the models. You need to have clear examples to help ChatGPT understand how your API is structured. And then as well, something that we think is really helpful is to provide informative error messages. But it's as well something that is quite generic, but potentially you could think about error message that are more tailored to ChatGPT to give ChatGPT options to query in a different manner your API if you think the query is not correct. So those are the kind of things that you can think about.
I think it's really fascinating, right? To on the one hand, we can look at, okay, you can just basically plug any open API description into ChatGPT, which is super cool. But on the other hand, well, ChatGPT is a little bit of a special API consumer, so to speak. So there are some additional constraints or some things that you probably should keep in mind. We won't dive into this a lot today, but it is important to keep in mind if you're trying to make your API work with ChatGPT. I think this list is something to look into a little bit further. We'll probably create a more detailed video later on, but for today, let's just dive into the next step. So what I found really interesting is that when we talked about what to do, you suggested, well, let's just use some API out there. And the API that we'll be looking at is the New York Times API. Right? So the New York Times has an interesting API where you can just search for articles and it's available for everybody to use. And it's a very simple API that is defined in OpenAPI, so you can just download the description in OpenAPI from the New York Times. And looking at this API and how well it works for ChatGPT, what would you say, Alex, are the most important things to keep in mind when you now try to make the New York Times available in ChatGPT?
So looking at this API, you have like as output of the API as response, we can have like many responses and results. And as ChatGPT is quite limited in the output, one of the key things is to filter out some data to make the response consumable by ChatGPT. So that's one of the first thing. And the additional thing is really working on the operation ID for the path so that it can be helpful as well for ChatGPT. So that's exactly what we have done with Blobr, filtering out some elements, and I can share the result of the Swagger that we have generated based on Blobr product. So where you have a clear operation ID for your endpoint, and the data and the response is limited with a few responses that are included, which are sufficient to ask questions about topics, about latest articles, but you might not have, of course, the pictures and all the media content that might be attached to New York Times. So trying to have a plugin is always trying to have like transform your API into a product that is really targeting a specific use case.
But in that case, right, what I find really cool, it's not just take your API. In that case, you actually take some other API, right? And you, so you could do that, I'm assuming, right? Also by writing code that would take the New York Times API and filter out certain fields. But then you'd have to write code, and maybe that's not what you want to do. And that's exactly what you've provided there as a feature, right? Where people can plug that API in, and then when they turn it into a product, you can add these filtering capabilities. So that I think in that case, the two main things that you had to keep in mind were the operation ID and then the size of the response, right? These were, I think, the main issues there. Okay. So now we have the New York Times API kind of filtered and published in a ChatGPT friendly way. And now let's look at how to actually make it available in ChatGPT, which I think is the cool part, where you just take kind of this tweaked OpenAPI definition and then make that available to ChatGPT. And can you please walk us a little bit through how this process works, which I think is actually fairly simple, but it does take a few steps.
Yes. So as you mentioned, we have created, and I was sharing before the OpenAPI spec, we have created a dedicated product, a New York Times product, where we have filtered out all those information. And Blobr has generated for us a plugin-based URL where you would find the manifest file, which is like a simple file describing the API to ChatGPT. And at the URL as well, you will get the OpenAPI spec and the logo potentially of your plugin. All this information is available from this link. So I just need to copy this information from Blobr in this case, and go to ChatGPT. And in ChatGPT, you need to go to a new chat, and in your new chat, you can create a plugin. So you go to the plugin section. You can go to the plugin store. And here, if you have this access to develop your own plugin, you can just click on it, enter the URL I've just created. So it will find the manifest file and the OpenAPI spec. You see that it found New York Times. There are some warnings because we generate different URLs between the consumption of the plugin and the consumption of the API, but no ways to make it work on ChatGPT. I click on next, and then I can install the unverified plugin for 15 developers. So I can install it for me and share it with others.
Yeah, and maybe there we should just, briefly mention that this whole ChatGPT plugin mechanism is relatively new. it was, I think, alpha until very recently, right, where only very few could even develop plugins. And now they've opened that up, but still in a kind of limited way. There's a verification step, right? If you want to make your ChatGPT plugin available to everybody, like in that plugin store. But for you to play around with it as a developer right now, all you need is, I think you need the OpenAI Plus subscription, right? Like the developer subscription, but then you're good to go.
Yes, definitely. You need the subscription, and I think you still need to request access, but in the next coming days might not be the case to create your own developer plugin. So as things evolve at the same time, anyway, when there is a plugin, you can consume it if you have a ChatGPT Plus option.
Yeah. Okay. Now let's install the plugin.
So actually, to install the plugin, I need an API key. The API key has been generated in this case by Blobr. So I can go to my authentication part of the portal, copy paste my API key into the verification, the step for installing the plugin. So now it has installed the New York Times plugin, and now I can start to ask questions. So for instance, I could ask a question, what are the latest news about Berkeley?
And thanks a lot for asking that question. Yeah, so we made sure, of course, that there are stories, to ask. And what you can see now is that the ChatGPT is accessing the plugin, and through that, the content on the New York Times webpage and or on the New York Times API, right? And now it creates for us that list of stories that are about Berkeley. And I just find that very, very cool to see that now I can just have chats that get access to real-time information from whatever sources there are that I make available through APIs. And so that's kind of the debug view, right?
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And that's quite cool because you can see the calls that are being made by ChatGPT and the response, which in this case has been filtered to make it work with ChatGPT. So you can see the response of the API of the plugin, and it's really cool to see and verify because ChatGPT has still the power to hallucinate. So sometimes it's good to come back as well to the data and to check whether you have good answers and if your plugin is working well. Another way to do that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting part kind of going forward. The more we use APIs that way, right, the more it will be interesting to figure out how exactly does ChatGPT interact with those plugins, right? And it's great that you can just see that and see what kind of queries did it come up with, because we don't exactly control that, right? That's kind of the magic of ChatGPT, just taking your text input and then turning that into some kind of API request that it fires off.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And so one way is definitely to control the number of calls that can be made. You control and filter the endpoints that can be used by different plugins. But then what is as well interesting is, as a user or as a provider, to look at the request history and the calls that have been made for a specific API. And in this case, there was only one call that has been made. But what is nice is that you can at any time replay the call as a user to check what is the call that has been done by ChatGPT. And you can see from the user agent as well that it has been done through OpenAI and ChatGPT. So it's a good way to isolate as well and understand which calls are being made through ChatGPT and the ones that are being made through the portal or directly in the code.
Yeah. And it's I think, it's going to be interesting going forward to see whether we will see like specific APIs just for ChatGPT, or multi-purpose APIs, so to speak, that can do both. But I think it's really cool to see at least that what you've done now, right, in a very, very simple way, is to take an existing API and expose it or wrap it in a way that it becomes usable for ChatGPT. Because again, right, the original New York Times API is not directly usable in ChatGPT because the responses are just too big. ChatGPT will just complain basically about the responses being too big, but it very easily can be transformed into one that is easy to consume. Are there any other features, Alex, that you would like to point out that are helpful to kind of work towards this transition with a little bit more AI friendly APIs, so to speak?
So definitely there is one of the things that you need to think about when you use ChatGPT is as well to have a good description of your product. So I think that being able to talk to APIs reinforce the need of having API products because you really need to have like use case based plugins to make it work in ChatGPT because of the limitations from ChatGPT, and it forces us API product managers, API owners to really think as what if my API would be used in ChatGPT? What are the business cases that I
Yeah.
should use? And I think it helps as well to think API products. So really excited about that.
That is very true, right? And whenever we talk about API products, I think two of the things we always talk about is documentation and description. I think in that case, the documentation really doesn't matter that much because it doesn't really, it's not getting used, but the description is. And in that case, I would say what we've done today, we made it very easy for us because we just used the OpenAPI description that the New York Times has created, and we did not put any effort into that. And without going into any detail, but I know that you have some, I think, experience in trying to make, let's say, APIs as nicely described as possible to
Mhm.
ChatGPT, right? And did you find that a complicated process or an easy process?
So yeah, it's as always, it's always a test and learn method because like there is not like a huge literature at the moment on the topic.
Yeah, they
So
don't tell us
discovering at the
much.
same time,
Yes.
yeah. But definitely, what I was mentioning with API product is that if you document your API as a product, if you have the spec as an API product, you will be able to implement the documentation in the spec as well as a way to describe even more your API. So that we are working on that. So everything that you could write in the documentation could be included in description, summarized in description to help even more ChatGPT to use the API. That's on one side. On one side, sorry, and on the other side, we try as well to help creating API spec, even if there is no API spec available. So
Uh,
already internally, we are using, for instance, HubSpot, all our tools, internal tools. We start to use it in ChatGPT. So you could segment the data between the different cells, who is using which part of HubSpot data from CRM API. Without the spec, we have just rebuilt the spec based on the APIs that we use and from the API keys. So with ChatGPT, you
mhm.
can even create the spec that are needed for your API, and then it's like really fascinating to do that.
Okay, so you know what? That is so interesting. I think I'll try to talk to into making another video, but we won't spend any time with that today. But again, right? I think there's a lot of stuff to be said and still probably thought about how to make APIs, how to design APIs, and how to document and describe APIs in the best possible way for consumption through ChatGPT or AI in general. Right? I think that's definitely going to be very. I think that's going to be a very interesting area going forward.
Definitely.
Alex, thanks so much for spending time, to talk to us, to prepare the demo and walk us through it. I think that's something that we really can see a little bit, the future of at least part of where APIs may be going, that we see more and more AI consumption of APIs. Any last words from you regarding this little experiment and how it worked?
It's a lot of fun, and I encourage everyone, even non-technical people, to do it because it's really fascinating, and you discover use cases every day. So really, like,
Yeah.
it's easy to start, and then when you start using it, you can't stop asking questions and find some cool insights. So yeah, really encourage everyone to test it out.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a very good closing words, right? And I totally agree. It's like you don't really need that much. All you need is like a little bit of open API literacy, understand a little bit how open API works, and then you can kind of start playing around with it. So yeah, I'd encourage everyone to do that. But also, from what we showed you today, be aware that this is probably looking very different a month from now or 2 months from now, right? Things are changing pretty quickly, but it's going to be really cool. Okay. Thanks so much, Alex, for joining us. Thanks, everybody, for watching. If you liked it, please give a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and I hope very soon we'll be back talking more about how to design and describe APIs for AI, so to speak, for ChatGPT. Bye, everybody, and see you soon.
See you.